Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight in our discussion of abolition as a Black-led movement, part of the Schomburg Curriculum, in which we're teaching with the Schomburg's primary sources. We're in for a treat. We have Nicole Daniels, the creator of this curriculum. And I want to tell you a bit about her as we begin. So Nicole is a writer, actor, content creator with a background in history and education. A former classroom teacher and museum educator, Nicole was previously a staff editor at the New York Times Learning Network. She also researched and wrote the slavery and abolition units of the curriculum that we'll be discussing today. Nicole, welcome. Thank you again
Thank
for
you.
being with us.
I'm so happy to be here.
Before we start talking a bit more specifically about the curriculum, including this incredible story of Nancy, an enslaved woman who used the court system for her emancipation, I wanted to have everyone learn a bit more about you. And in particular, could you tell us a bit about your time at the New York Times, the Learning Network?
Sure. So I was a staff editor on the Learning Network for about 3 years. The Learning Network was originally created in 1998, and it's a part of the Times. There's my cat validating what I'm saying. Um, and the intention and the goal of the Learning Network is to provide educators and their students in the middle and high school levels with lesson plans, student opinion prompts, and other teaching resources that use New York Times articles, videos, all sorts of sources as the driving source. And so that's what I was doing there, but always with a focus. I wrote about a lot of different things, but because of my own interests, there was often a focus on history.
Mm. And included in that, your lessons corresponded to the New York Times content. And I was
Yeah.
wondering if you could speak a bit to that as well.
Sure. Well, so each day we would pitch starting at around 9 a.m., pitch an article that we thought could be relevant to students and teachers. And so we're thinking about the Common Core, but other standards as well. And then throughout that day, we would develop a lesson plan. And so it taught me to write on a really quick deadline because it was often
Mhm.
like 6, 7 hours. And we wanted a range, like this source that or this article that you've just pulled up, a range of stories and perspectives of things that are interesting to students, but that also might relate to other things they're learning in the classroom.
That's wonderful. Last question about the Learning Network, because I see a lot of parallels to what you did with the Schomburg curriculum, which we'll get to in a moment. But the Learning Network's genesis, what were its goals? What you mentioned some of the target audience in terms of students, but what were the goals and the extent of the outreach?
Sure. I think there is definitely a media literacy focus, and also a current events focus on the materials that was being presented. And I think in my time there personally, because of my interests, I was particularly interested in telling different stories of intersectionality, of race and gender and sexuality, and making those materials accessible for young people. And also in my time there, I started an accessible activities page where we provided lessons for students for whom the average New York Times article might not be as accessible for them. So with additional scaffolding and resources and often shorter articles or more visual articles. So I think there are many different goals within the Learning Network and lots of different places where I was sort of able to try out different skills and build.
Well, the Schomburg curriculum also had the benefit of all of this expertise because you were working on this on in the archive simultaneous to the work that you were doing at the Times. And so before we talk specifically about Nancy and the case, I want to now just give kind of an overview of some of what you'll see in abolition as a Black-led movement and the curriculum as a whole. And this is some of the pedagogical approach. And Nicole, as I talk, I'm going to ask you as the creator to then, add some more. but kind of in broad strokes across all of our curricula, which again, compared to what you were saying at the Times, these are primary sources going into the archives, pulling things out. There's much more time and kind of serendipitous path of discovery. So it's also kind of interesting to me that you had these two incredibly different paces as you were doing this work, getting into the hearts and minds of children and youth. It's pretty incredible. So back to the Schomburg curriculum, this pedagogical approach is investigating visual elements, looking closer. This is primary source inquiry. And then layering in that reading for understanding. Additional scaffolding might include a comparative element and so on. Nicole, could you say a little bit more about that pedagogical approach?
Yeah, so some of the structure, I will say, was definitely informed by my time as a museum educator at the Tenement Museum, especially starting with visual elements and finding more easier, more accessible ways for students to approach primary sources. I actually think this slide is perfect because as you look at it, it's in cursive, which already so many students cannot read. It looks old, that there can be an immediate rejection. And for a lot of young people, it's like your brain kind of shuts down seeing something like this. And so I think the intention with starting with a photograph, a drawing, something from a newspaper that's more visual, is to get students talking, and then of course with guiding questions as well. And I think the other piece of that, of the guiding questions, is talking to them about what are their beliefs and their preconceived notions around these topics. And so that sort of fit into that first layer of investigation before actually diving into the primary source itself, and really going back and forth. That within the curriculum we have the primary source guide of just the first time taking it in visually, then trying to see, can you pull out any words? Are you able to pull out any dates, any years? What do we know about this? And then once again returning to it with a transcript to make sure all students can access what's written. um, yeah, I think that structure was so important even in trial lessons that we did with students and teachers. It became apparent that as much support that we could give, the better. That's what I would say on this structure.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Let's now talk about the case. So, again, you uncovered this going through archives and then created this lesson. Could you start a little with some of the framing?
Yeah. Well, I guess even before talking about the source, I probably total looked at like 100+ sources. And now that's not to say that I spent a long time with each of them, but in taking out boxes in the archives, looking through, notating, okay, maybe we could use this and maybe this could fit in to one of these categories of lessons. Um, but I will say this source immediately, like I fell in love with it. I was like, this is a really incredible story. Um, and in looking back at some of my notes, it was actually one that we started and did in a really early on trial lesson with students, because we just wanted to see, like, might this be taking us in the right direction? And students really were receptive and responded really positively and had lots of thoughts about it and reactions emotionally and otherwise. And so that was a reason that we kept on with this source. And yeah, it was like really like guiding source as we structured the whole curriculum. Um, yeah, that's what I'll say. And I can get, oh, and a thumbs up. I can get into the content of it, but I don't know if you want to add anything first.
I'd say one piece, we'll talk about how this fits into a larger context, but everything that we're offering for consideration is meant to complement what educators are doing already. So it's not supplementing something. So sometimes these primary sources are in conversation with each other. Sometimes they're meant just to be used in isolation, or again, to go along with something a teacher's already doing. So I would say with this in particular, and part of why we wanted to celebrate it as we go into Juneteenth, is to think about this idea of Black resilience and agency, especially around the concept of abolition, where it's often associated with white activists. So there's a piece where thematically, I think it is both timely and the source is really compelling.
Definitely. And what I'll say is one of the questions before even getting into the source that's in the curriculum is about when we think of an abolitionist, who are we picturing? And certainly in conversations I had with students, it was often a white person. And so it's pushing up against that.
So in this, we're in 1828. It's Nancy, a woman of color, versus Joseph Butler. Could you tell us a little bit about the case? And there's also, throughout the curriculum, there's quotations, and other kind of supportive materials. And this quote from Dr. Sinha, could you read it and tell us a little bit about what it means to you, why you chose it to frame this artifact?
Sure. Women were abolition's foot soldiers, its leaders and orators. In birthing the first women's rights movement, abolition again revealed its radical face. And I love that quote. And I remember reading The Slave's Cause and finding it, and it was after I think I had actually found this source, and I was just like, well, and there we have it. And I think on multiple levels, it pushes against preconceived notions, both of we're picturing an abolitionist, it's probably a white person and not just any white person, a man. And there was truly a precedent for this case that we're about to see. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. And I might add just one caveat as we're in this kind of early stage that came up a lot in working with educators and workshopping this source, but others, was I had several educators say, my concern with this curriculum is that it makes it seem like slavery wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
And that students and the educators are saying, I know that's not true, but for my students, they're going to say, wait a minute, well, if they could just sue, then it couldn't have been that bad. And for the most part, they're talking about Black students. And I think I can think back to being a kid in school and like seeing roots, or the only time that we're talking about Black history is in the context of slavery. And so I think there is immediately this defensiveness of like, well, I don't want that to be my only story. And then seeing, okay, people could advocate for themselves. Okay, then maybe it wasn't that bad. And so I think, this is where the burden is really on the educator to add a lot of that nuance. But I just want to kind of acknowledge that because it is something that came up time and time again in talking with educators was like, but does this make it seem like, yeah, it wasn't that bad, which is kind of hard for me to wrap my mind around, but I also see why students react in that way.
So what I'm hearing, and let's move on to the next slide as well, please. But what I'm hearing is then this need for context.
Mhm.
And also for me, as someone who's looked at all the curricula and is part of that effort to support educators and using it in the classroom, I also think this is a fairly sophisticated document. Like it serves an older student. We're looking middle school through high school, but there needs to be some kind of grounding in context. Or conversely, this is the spark for that continued grounding in context.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Well, and I think it's even just that we're looking at somebody speaking up, but after something horrible happened, or, resisting punishment while enslaved. So it's that larger context of being enslaved is what's really at the forefront. And that piece of resistance is important and that piece of agency. But right, that the larger context of the time period and the situation is what is most present, I think.
Also, one thing that is another further inquiry is the reactions of the legal system.
Right.
And so there is a push-pull because as you create precedent, there then becomes the legal system working against that
Mhm.
precedent, which is that inviting a further inquiry.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Could you say a bit more now about the case itself? And we've highlighted a quote that if you wouldn't mind reading.
Yeah. So, Nancy, a woman of color, by her attorney, complains of Joseph Butler of a plea of trespass, assault, and battery and false imprisonment. This is happening in Arkansas Territory, in the county of Clark. And it goes on to say the date that this happened, assaulted the plaintiff and hit them, and they're beat, bruised, and wounded, took and imprisoned and restrained her of her liberty and held her in servitude from the first day of November, aforesaid, until the first day of January 1828, against the law of the land and against the will of the plaintiff. And he ends up, Joseph Butler, who imprisoned Nancy, ends up having to pay $2,000 in damages as a result of this suit, which is in some ways that, I mean, there are layers to why this is so incredible of both that she knew this was an option, that she knew she could use the courts, and we see that precedent and thinking back to that quote as well, but that she's successful and is recognized as a victim and is able to be paid in damages. And it's especially in 1828, I think the time that we're looking at, there are all of these layers of like, wow, how did this happen? And it's
Yeah.
also incredible that it happened. Um, and I think that's why this source just immediately I was drawn to it, and I was like, we have to talk about this.
I know you're not a legal scholar, but it does make like based on your research and inquiry, why was this case able to be victorious?
I think there was precedent, I think, for people speaking up in these ways, but there was not yet precedent for this being shut down. That she still had that legal recourse was open, um, is my understanding. And I really tried to find out more about Nancy, and so there were several people who she could have been in the census, but at that time, the census wasn't consistent in terms of listing first and last names of Black people, and certainly not if they were enslaved. And I mean, the census was always quite inconsistent, but it is exciting as a historian, like when you can track somebody down and be like, oh,
Right.
they existed here and in this other place. I will say that just in doing some recent research, I found that Joseph Butler actually was he was appointed as some kind of neighborhood watch person, that being contemporary language. But that was some position that also in the courts he is recorded as having. And so it really ties in this past present piece too of surveillance and kind of vigilantes taking out action on and killings, beatings on Black people, that brings us to today.
Thank you for that. There's actually many other cases that have yet to really have a light shined on them of people using the court system, particularly Black women. And one of them actually comes from our archives. We feature another figure, and this is from Black women and self-representation. And in this series, we look at Sojourner Truth. And Sojourner Truth is actually the first Black woman in the US to win a court case. And she sued to win the freedom of one of her children. I'll say more about that case in a little bit. And actually, this element of the curriculum doesn't feature the legal case, but it is worth kind of noting and celebrating Sojourner Truth in a variety of ways. And so what I wanted to do is connect Sojourner Truth at first by just kind of pausing and looking at the primary source itself for a minute. And Nicole, this is a curriculum that you didn't work on, but I know you've seen before. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you see. And
Sure. I mean, yeah. I think if I were looking at this for the first time or having students look at it, I would ask them about what she's wearing, what choices are there, that I see, often have students start just, what do you see? I see a purse, that might indicate that this person has money and some means. I see the cane, which I'm sure students would be like, she's old, or might also be a sign of strength and grounding. I imagine students would comment on, okay, she has a shawl, she has something covering her head. She's also wearing glasses. What does that tell us? Okay, if somebody's wearing glasses, they probably can read. And I think that those kinds of questions I would come to this document with, and students would as well. And then I might add some context of, okay, these cartes de visite, she actually copyrighted her own image for this and then was selling the carte de visite, which not just she did this, other abolitionists would do this as well. And the funds she received were used for her own activism and her own causes. And there is this irony of she is someone who was once sold, her being. And here she is choosing how she's presenting and her image, and she's selling that image and she's taking that ownership. That I think would be like the second layer that we would not likely get just from looking at the image, though maybe reading that text we might get there. Yeah, those are some thoughts that come up for me.
thank you for that. Now, again, this isn't featured in the lesson plans we created, but I do think it's worth noting how, and this is for me, the ways in which artifacts are in conversation with each other and connect and tell a larger story. So, Sojourner Truth, she was born Isabella Boumtree in upstate New York. And the New York State part is critical because there's state law that comes into place that helps her secure her freedom and also her children's. So 1799, there is the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery in New York. And long story short, what it does is puts a time frame on the amount of enslavement, and then interestingly different by gender. So for men age 28, there's manumission, and for females age 25. It turns out Sojourner Truth was born 2 years before the start of when this law would go into effect. That said, in 1817, there was an amendment to it that actually gave a greater latitude for the age of the amount of time in enslavement to then emancipation. So she was owned by John Dumont, one of her, and he had promised to follow this law. When it comes time, he does not. She decides to leave. I don't know that the word escape comes to mind as much as she asserts her rights and goes. She takes her youngest daughter with her and leaves the Dumont residence. Dumont then, which is also breaking the law, he sells her child, John. Can we go back, stay on the slide, please? She sells John to an enslaver in Alabama. So Sojourner Truth, with the help of white activists, and again, she's going by her given name, Isabella Boumtree at the time, she sues. And part of the reason she's able to sue is that gradual emancipation in New York State law also added a slight protection that you couldn't be transferred out of the state. So because that would have been a way to circumvent the law. So if you stay in the state of New York, when you come of age, you are emancipated, is part of the promise made. So by selling this 5-year-old boy, he's again trying to circumvent that law. Some people view it also as retaliatory towards Sojourner Truth, who, asserts her rights and leaves. That said, she goes to court and she wins the case. And Peter, her son, is returned to her. And again, this is the first time a Black woman is able to legally gain emancipation through the courts. And if you want to know more about that, we're going to put a link in the chat. So actually, PBS, Learning Media, has done an incredible job of putting together a series of enslaved women seeking freedom through the courts. It's a series of lessons that feature various figures, and I want to just name them. We don't have time to go into all of their stories, but Elizabeth Freeman, Rosamund Bentley, hopefully these names become more known along with Sojourner Truth. And Nancy, though we don't have a surname for me, is a heroic figure. So again, you'll see that in the chat, that link to PBS, but also I want to pause and invite you to be thinking of questions you might have as we go, and you can put them in the chat and we'll try to get to some of those at the end of our conversation.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, please.
No, I don't want to overwhelm with other sources and things, but as you were talking, I was reminded of In the Shadow of Slavery by Leslie Harris, which is such a great book about Black people and slavery in New York, from the 1600s to the mid 1800s. And there's so much there. And we actually used quite a bit of it for another lesson we were working on developing. So I just want to shout out that book. Yeah.
Can you say that title one more time, please?
In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863. And that's Leslie Harris, who also worked with the Tenement Museum quite a bit. He's a really great historian.
Thank you so much for that. Let's return now to a bit more about the Schomburg curriculum and talk through, again, we featured one of the primary sources, Nancy's story, but what I appreciate is the way in which you've thoughtfully surrounded it and kind of scaffolded the lessons. And we'll stay with abolition as a Black-led movement. So there are 4 primary sources that are featured, and they kind of scale in terms of complexity and ability to understand. And so let's look at that first scaffolded source. So this is, I don't know, a warm-up activity in some ways doesn't feel quite right based on the heft of the content, but from an educator standpoint, it's a way in which you're kind of warming up your students to that primary source inquiry and also kind of initial thinking about the content. This is an etching from 1858, and it's what one might consider a more traditional or well-known abolitionist propaganda, in which you see white people featured. And the image is white abolitionists cutting down an upas tree. The upas tree has the word slavery on it. Within the leaves, there are other different kind of signal words that are helping to serve an abolitionist cause. The other thing I'll say about the upas tree is actually incredibly poisonous. So the symbolism of that is quite striking to me, that if you stand next to it and inhale, it's poisonous. So that's the degree to which they're using the metaphor for an abolitionist cause. But there's so much from a primary source inquiry approach that you can use. Nicole, why is this the warm-up?
I mean, I'll go back a bit to what I talked about earlier, but just of the importance of having a visual heavy. I will say this particular visual source does have text in it, but it's such a great opener for students. And there are certainly words within that that students might not recognize. And so that gives them an opportunity to further ask questions. But when our model questions for it are just, I notice and I wonder.
Yeah.
And so that gives so much space to students at all different levels. And then through the facilitation that the teacher is providing, you can go deeper. And then after we have a bunch of I notice and I wonder, then we have I feel blank looking at this image because. And so that's where we're hoping to go a little bit deeper. And I will say that with this source, there is a great doc chat. And that's part, which is something that New York Public Library does, in which historians or researchers, librarians sit around and talk about a document. And there is one for this particular source. And so it's a really nice way, I think, of if you look at this, you do the work around the source and then spend, I think we have them like just listen to 3 or 4 minutes of the doc chat to dig a little bit deeper. And then we can go into deeper inquiry questions once the students better understand, okay, what is this source? Who created it? And those might be questions I would start to ask before presenting the doc chat of like, whose perspective is this? Who's featured in it? Who's not featured? Which is a thing that, especially when doing archival work about Black history, is one of our biggest questions. What is not being said? That something that would often, this is a little bit parenthetically, but something that would often come up in workshopping these lessons was teachers saying, well, but a lot of these sources are written by white people. And yeah, that is true. And so there's and I wouldn't hide that from students. I think that's a really, really helpful thing for them to know and then interrogate and be like, yeah, why is that the case? And what bias might be there? And then why don't we have written or other documentation or as much from Black people at this time period or whatever time period? And so I think that question of what is not being said, whose voices are not heard, are so, so important to primary source investigation.
Thank you for that. I'd also add, that part of that why, which actually takes me back to Sojourner Truth. So much of what we see written about and by Sojourner Truth is of her time period, of her speeches and so on, transcribed by white abolitionists with various interpretations. And she's not the only one. And part of that is because she was denied the right as an enslaved person to read and write in English. So, there's kind of a deeper dive that we do with that in Black women and self-representation, but that is a piece. But why I think for me as a warm-up initial, it does fit the usual kind of stereotypical notions that some people have and think of in terms of abolitionists. Like if you think of an image of an abolitionist and you were asking what comes to mind. The other thing I'd say is that it invites kind of like a graphic visual analysis. For me, I'm always struck by the fact that the slavery is listed vertically, then trunk, and then goes up to these other ideas. So there's also the ways in which thinking about the artistry of it, along with the messaging. Let's look at the next source. So this actually goes back to the carte de visite. So this is a portrait of an unidentified man circa 1860, 1869. Nicole, could you talk a little bit more about the carte de visite as an abolitionist? It wasn't solely used as an abolitionist piece, but the ways in which it was.
Of course. Yeah. So, I mean, they're little, if you haven't seen one before, they are actually quite small cards that could be reprinted. And somebody might, have their photograph taken and give it to someone as a gift. But what we see as it relates to Black people and abolition is it becomes this opportunity for Black people to commission photographs of themselves and images as they want to be seen. And so you'll often notice, like what I would probably ask students about this one would be similar questions of like noticing, okay, this person is wearing a suit and that is a choice. And we get a sense of, access to money and standing socially or otherwise. And there were cartes de visite that were very heavy, kind of in a propaganda sense, particularly as it comes to colorism and showing there are very like, look, this child is enslaved and look how white they appear. And so those tended to be made by white abolitionists and were also sold for money. And so there's that kind of category of cartes de visite. And then there are these which I feel like more show Black people saying, this is how I want to be viewed, this is how I want to be represented, and also remembered. Because going back to that piece of not having as many sources from Black people themselves, well, this is a source, and it's not a journal entry or a diary or a letter, but a lot can be told by this, and just the choice of doing it, of saying, I want my image to be captured and I want it to be shared.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, Sojourner Truth actually copyrighted that image, and she's controlling that image, including the caption that she wants to live beneath it. The carte de visite, that term is French, and as you were saying, it's a small photograph and it's mounted on cardstock. And then it gets reproduced from negatives on the thin paper. So it's this kind of like precise process of making this card. And it was actually patented by a French photographer, Alphonse Eugène Distéry, in like mid 1850s or mid 1800s. And then by like the later 1850s, you see Black Americans starting to embrace and use the cards as well. And actually, if you want to know a bit more about the carte de visites, the New York Public Library has created an audio guide to go with the collection. The cards have been digitized. And so there is a collection at the Schomburg, but there's also archives that exist elsewhere in NYPL system. And the audio guide gives a more historical complement and context, including names of some of the people in the cards, and also a great resource for people to see.
Yes, highly recommend. And there's so much from just an educator's standpoint that you can do by using this guide. So yeah, it's a good one.
So the final source in abolition as a Black-led movement, again, we talked about the scaffolding, is a source that is abolition as a Black-led movement, but actually there's a nuance here in that this is a petition to the city of Savannah. It's a city meeting that's actually white citizens. And so the why of that is actually in reaction to, like, here's some of that legal and political response to Black activism. So I'm going to read just a bit. So again, this is a petition to the city of Savannah in 1795. So the city meeting takes place, and this is some of the result of that meeting. Whereas from the mischiefs which the people of Saint Domingo and other French islands have experienced, and then goes on to, in particular, talk about a fear of having Blacks come into Savannah, which is a major port, including in the transatlantic slave trade, to have revolutionaries come, right? So Saint Domingo refers to the Haitian Revolution, and that's in 1791. And it's actually a successful revolt that leads to the formation of the first Black free nation of Haiti from that. So there's the way in which there's this real fear and ripple effect that's happening, including then this, if someone has been in the Caribbean, particularly French holding territories, for more than a month and they're Black, they actually can't get off the boat, even if they have been someone who's been purchased in Savannah. Nicole, is there something else that comes to mind for you as you think about this source?
I mean, I will say I love this source. Like, I was very excited that we were able to include it. Sorry. Just because, well, the scaffolding it's so text heavy. So we ran into several sources like this that were really interesting to work with, but yes, it's not written in cursive, but there's just a lot of text there, which can shut a lot of kids down. But I think in terms of past present connections, that is why I love this source of this idea of what I picture is like a contemporary neighborhood watch group talking about, okay, there have been a lot more break-ins, and I feel like I've seen some people riding around the neighborhood who don't belong. And I think that that's a context that students are familiar with, and certainly for students of color, of feelings of being seen as suspicious. And so I think that that's one lens that we can view this source from. And then just kind of on a higher level of the fear that that resistance
Yeah.
created, that it's not even like actively something happening on these shores, but it's the fear of, wow, this could really shift things. And I don't know if this is a good time to mention it, but I have one other source that wasn't included that kind of gives a similar thing. Should I
Yeah, this is a
that now?
perfect time.
Okay, so there's, and you can look up this source. It is digitized now, or it's partially digitized, and it's
Personally, yeah.
Friendship Plantation Journal. Um, and this is a plantation log, and it's in, let's see, remember it being in a British colony, but I'd have to double check on that. Anyway, what is so fascinating about this journal is there are many different things listed. Here are the crops, here are the whatever. But within it is a punishment log.
Oh,
And
wow.
what is included are the offenses of the enslaved people and the resulting punishment. And what I found so fascinating about both of those things is that the offenses I felt like were sites of resistance.
Mhm.
These groups of people were talking. Okay, well, we can wonder, well, what were they talking about? Another one that came up all the time was refusing to work, showing up to work late. And I think one interpretation of that is this is a moment of agency, that I am enslaved. I have no choice, no control over my life. But you know what I can do? I can not work. I can like strike. And I'll say I both love this source because of that, but this source haunted me the most because it isn't online. In the digital collections, it's 3 pages. It's actually like 20 pages. And just reading, I think particularly the punishment side was so disturbing to me. But I think it's one of, it feels similar to the document in Savannah, where we're seeing this fear from white people of Black people organizing. Like I think a lot of what was being punished was organizing, and that's of course my interpretation. But yeah, that it just makes me think of that source as well.
Um, Thank you. As I mentioned, we're taking questions in the chat, and I know I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all of them, but there's one question that came in that actually is timely. We've mentioned more than once the going into the archives, and yes, some of it's digitized, but how do I actually physically get in? And I know I'm getting some assistance in the chat. If there's any links that you can put in about what I'm about to say, it would be welcome. So yeah, the question is, if I'm a teacher, how can I get in to look at the various primary sources? So the Schomburg is part of the New York Public Library system. We're here to serve the public, which means the archives are open to the public. It requires having an NYPL library card, which is for Manhattan, Queens, and Staten Island and the Bronx. Let me say, no, not Queens. This is bad. I should get this right. But more importantly, it's linked by boroughs. I believe it's Brooklyn and Queens that have a separate system. But that NYPL card allows you to then view our special collections and request appointments. And that as a teacher, I've gone in, I've taken images and then used them in a classroom, even beyond the Schomburg curriculum. That said, unfortunately, children can't go in and look at these primary sources, or young people, in part due to the delicacy of the archives. So the Schomburg curriculum is a way in which we're trying to bring some of these rich sources into to a younger audience as well. Again, we'll keep going, but we'll keep looking out for some more questions, and thank you for that one. I want to talk briefly about the curriculum as a whole. And so Abolition as a Black-led movement is actually one of 7 guides that we've created so far, and there's more in the process. And I believe that the source, Nicole, that you're mentioning may actually be used in a later lesson. I don't want to make that promise yet, but you're reminding me of its potency. So you can see them displayed on screen. We've been talking about abolition as a Black-led movement, which is to the far right, and it's part of a slavery and abolition series of documents, which include race, racism, and white supremacy, is another series of 4 primary sources that Nicole worked on with lessons, approaches, and so on. Our most recent is on our founder, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. So it's Arturo A. Schomburg's life and legacy. And Arturo Schomburg, just briefly about him, came to the US from Puerto Rico. His mother was from the Virgin Islands. His father comes to Puerto Rico by way of Germany, hence the name Schomburg. So we're in the 1870s, 1880s, and he's in a classroom. And a teacher, and I paraphrase, told him that Black people had made no discernible contributions to culture and history. So I know many of us are educators on the call, and this is a moment of really horrific teaching taking place, yet it has incredible fruits and benefits in the future. Schomburg comes to the US and he actually starts collecting. He's in Harlem in around the 1920s and the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance. And he is collecting not just in Harlem, but he also starts traveling Black diasporic content that celebrates culture, history, beyond. In 1925, hence our centennial, the New York Public Library purchases his then 10,000 artifacts. The Schomburg now has over 11 million. And so again, this moment, this horrific moment in a classroom ended up being transformed in this amazing way. So this curricula is a glimpse of that. I'll say briefly the others: Black women writers and Black women in self-representation, Sojourner Truth, that carte de visite from her lives in Black women in self-representation. And then the last 2 published so far, The Aesthetics of Black Power and The Black Panther Party in Harlem. So in this next slide, you'll see there is a QR code if you wish to download. We are the public library. We're here to serve you. So these are free, downloadable guides. They're PDFs. Educators can print out key documents and photocopy them for their students. There's historical context. There's also, Nicole was mentioning accessibility. There are transcripts that are put, the text laid out, but also we've translated into Spanish. We have one source in Black Women in Self-Representation that's actually in Spanish, and then there's an English translation. So I do hope that you download them, look at them, use them. And also, I'm going to give more time for questions in a minute, but I want to also offer myself to you. If we can go to that next slide. This is me. I'm Cara Hill. So as the Educator Development Specialist at the Schomburg, I have the honor of helping educators link to the materials. My email's listed here. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I've gone into different schools and visited. There's also various workshops, including this. Sometimes our workshops are offered in person, and if you are a Department of Educator teacher, that means you can get CTLE credit. So all of this to say that this is an ongoing process and conversation. Nicole, I am so grateful that you're here. Before we field some questions, though, I'm wondering, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I guess there are two little things. One is just to shout out Dr. Lauren O'Brien, who is a public historian who wrote and researched those other units, and who I had the pleasure of working with also at the Tenement Museum when she came to
Oh.
help develop a walking tour of Black people's history on the Lower East Side. So that's one. And I also just think I want to just acknowledge how important this curriculum. I mean, I worked on it almost 4 or 5 years ago at this point, but how important it feels now in particular when we're seeing, I'm just going to say like comprehensive history slashed because Black history is the history of America. And as that is becoming harder and harder for teachers to be able to teach or being targeted for teaching it, I think having these resources is so vital in all of these different units. And I also just want to say that this, when I came on board, was an IMLS grant funded position and project, and that I am so grateful for that, and that work and the work that the IMLS does is really important as well. So those are my little.
Thank you
I
for
guess that
both.
would be my last dot to it all. My
Well,
side.
the IMLS is the Institute for Museum and Library Sciences. And so that's a federal grant that the Schomburg took and used to create this curriculum. And then NYPL as a whole is then taking the work and going forward. Let's take a few questions. And as we do that, could we go back to the slide that has the QR code, just in case? And that again is that chance to download. I think there might also be a link that was put in the chat. So this question is kind of a tough one. And in some ways, I think it lives as a comment, Nicole, but I want to honor it and offer it up for consideration. So once the enslaved were free, what did Black folks tend to choose as a way to live
Hmm.
and with dignity? Question mark.
Hmm.
And so that's a fairly broad question, but it does beg that inquiry of like what happens after.
I mean, I think we see several things happening after both this moment of there being increased opportunities for Black people in government, um, and then that being completely slashed and shut down. And that there was this, I think, moment of hope after the Civil War of, okay, suddenly we're seeing Black people in government with more possibilities for life, and then a legal and violent shutdown of Reconstruction.
Yep.
That I think we then see that legacy up to today. Like I think we are living in the legacy of the fall of Reconstruction in many ways. And that, well, what I think that there's a piece of that question. Is it saying at the end there of living with dignity, or what? Can you remind me?
Yeah, I think and with dignity. So that's exactly how it was phrased. But
Yeah.
to my mind, it's um, I think we should kind of just sit with that. Again, I wanted to really honor and name that because it is that invites us all to think about more richly. But in light of time, I'd love to turn to a few more questions. And thank you for all of these,
Or,
by the
and
way.
can I just say
Yeah,
just one thing
please,
about
please.
that? I think regardless of if somebody was a sharecropper or what happened to them, kind of on a just logistical or otherwise level of what their options were, and like living in the Jim Crow South, that wouldn't be good. That would be awful. But I think that I hope that that piece of dignity wouldn't be shut down by what someone's work or day-to-day life is. That I think what that's sort of the driving force throughout this whole curriculum too
Yeah.
is granting people that dignity that they deserved and that I imagine they presented with and asked for and expected, even if it was shut down. So I think that's the only thing I'll add there.
No, that's really wonderful. Thank you for that. Questions are coming in for you about your approach in the research. Because again, we see this final result, which, by the way, all of this is free and downloadable. I know I said that. And there's no commitment. It's not a program in which someone's signing up and say, I'm using lessons. It's really there for you to use as you wish. And as we've gone further in later guides, we've shown even how it meets certain state standards, like in the Arturo Schomburg. And I also serve as a resource to help educators think about how this could complement, how it could go with materials that requires no commitment. I would say I've also how it's been used in the classroom. This was a question, and then Nicole, I'll throw that last one back to you. How it's been used in the classroom. I recently went to Fort Hamilton High School in Brooklyn, and the kids were in, this was 3 sections of high school juniors, and they're reading The Things They Carried, which is a historical fiction of Vietnam written by Tim O'Brien, who is a white soldier, and his taking his experiences and creating narrative. And so I don't have a slide for this, I'm sorry, but in the curriculum Aesthetics of Black Power, we feature some buttons from the Black is Beautiful, Say It Loud, I'm Black, I'm Proud, being one of them. And then that goes together with a editorial from a Black GI to the Amsterdam News, in which he was told by his white platoon officer that he had to take the buttons off his helmet. And those of you who might know, that images in history of Vietnam, all the soldiers were decorating their helmets in various ways. And so it was just really wonderful the way the kids in the classroom thought about those primary sources. And we did use that kind of more open, what do you notice, what do you wonder, and then layered in, as Nicole explained earlier, and then tied it to a text that they were reading and thinking about the things that this real GI, or rather this real soldier, was carrying as he was in Vietnam. I then also layered in some statistics, which I won't go into now, that also kind of built on the interpretation. But that was one of the kind of practical ways this was used, and hopefully the teacher uses more, I don't know, but it was a chance to use archival sources as part of existing classroom material. A last question that it's come up more than once, so I want to frame it, paraphrase it, is about Nicole and your research. Because again, you talked about going through so many different boxes and so on in your inquiry, but what are some of the ways you structure your archival research? And you're a writer creatively as well, and you're doing research, but how do you even begin that initial dive into the archives?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Virgo, so I begin with a spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet has many, many columns. And so I would just start by taking out a box based on year or theme, and also region, because it is transatlantic slavery we're looking at. So I was not just looking at the United States proper. And then I would go through literally every document and make a little note about not necessarily each document, but ones that stood out, and a summary of like, this is what's in this box. Here are some things that might be interesting. And one of the columns was about, here's a potential curricular tie-in, or here is something that might relate. And I think another piece of that was accessibility. So if it was a source that I couldn't even transcribe just as I'm looking at it quickly, I'm like, this might be really challenging for students, because we do want for them, even if it's a source that's written in cursive, we want for them to be able to actually engage with it. So I think that was another category. And then some just started to rise to the top. And I think I had like, those would be highlighted in green. And then I would speak with Brian Jones, who I worked with on this project. And we would say, okay, like, here's a bunch of sources that stood out to me this week. these are the kind of pockets because like abolition as a black-led movement didn't exist as we knew the broad categories of like transatlantic slavery, black women's stories, black power movement. But within that, we imagined there would be two or three additional units. And then it was this question of like, well, how many primary sources go into each one? Should those be primary sources as like the main focus, or are some going to be warm-ups? And so it was a lot of moving things around. And so my notes in that spreadsheet really helped me to say, like, wait, there was actually a very visual source. And maybe that comes back in as a warm-up. Um, so that was my process. And I will say that though this took much, much longer, the work that I was doing also at the times of having to do a quick turnaround, I think both processes informed each other
Yeah.
of like, okay, let me not spend too much time on this. Do I think this has legs? Do I think there's potential? Okay, let's push that one forward and let me kind of play around with like what might some guiding questions be? How might this show up in the classroom? And I would say also that experience of being a museum educator and really working with so many school groups and seeing how they respond to different sources and where are middle schoolers and high schoolers going immediately with certain sources informed my process.
To what degree were you consulting curators at the Schomburg, librarians?
That was certainly early on of like, okay, this is what we're trying to do. Where should I start? They were super, super helpful and kind of guiding me because I was in all of the different divisions. So I spent a lot of time, um, oh boy, and I don't remember what they're all called now,
So
but
art and
manuscripts.
artifacts. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I spent a lot of time in like the manuscripts division, but then also spent a lot of time in art and artifacts, and that's where I was working with a bunch of cartes de visite. And the curators are such experts and would bring out things that I hadn't even thought of. And there are, of course, limitations when looking through the catalog online. And certainly because not as much was digitized, we had a lot of things digitized for this project. It was really great when someone would be like, wait a minute, there is this source that, or there's this box that we haven't spent a lot of time with, maybe take a look at it. And so they were an invaluable resource.
So I think the carte de visite lived in photos and prints,
Photos, yes,
right?
yes.
And art and artifacts, and then manuscripts, archives, and rare books.
That's where I was the most.
Is yeah, that's actually so people are welcome to email the curators with questions. And there is the email, Schomburg, I don't know its exact, but manuscript archives and rare books and so on, that they can write directly. And there's also the Jean Blackwell Hudson Library, and we have librarians in that who also can help guide people as they're going into specific research. There is a last thing I'll say about it as someone who's also gone into the archives for later curricular guides. There's sometimes the serendipity being open to that, where, there's the unexpected that comes in that path of discovery that I'm not going in necessarily with, okay, I've got to find X, Y, and Z. I have an initial approach, but then once I realize the connections, it starts to lead me in other directions, along with, as you're saying, that, being organized was really what I heard. I'm not a Virgo, but I try. So thank you for that. I know that we're out of time, but again, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your time now, but also all of this time and dedication into creating these wonderful materials. So thank you again, and thank you all for coming. I hope you have a good evening.